Hello, guys. Thank you for being here and for choosing to spend your time with this story. Whether you're listening late at night, resting after a long day, or simply letting this play quietly in the background, your presence truly means a lot. These long, calm stories are made to be unhurried, to move slowly, and to give your thoughts plenty of room to settle. If you find this kind of storytelling relaxing or comforting, you're always welcome to support the channel by liking the video and considering subscribing. It helps these long, detailed stories reach more people who may be looking for something gentle to listen to. And if you feel like sharing, I'd genuinely love to know where in the world you're listening from. It's always grounding to remember that these stories travel far beyond where they're told. Tonight, we'll be drifting back into the medieval world to explore a side of history that rarely makes it into legends. We'll talk about what life was really like for medieval knights, not the shining armor and heroic poses, but the long training that began in childhood, the physical pain that never truly faded, the fear that followed them even in moments of peace, and the quiet disappointments that waited at the end of the road. This is a slow journey. We'll move through years rather than moments, through daily life as much as battle, and through the thoughts and experiences that shaped knights long after the fighting stopped. There's no rush here. So get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and allow the medieval world to unfold gently around you. Chapter 1: The Dream of Knighthood. For many people today, the medieval knight exists as an image more than a reality. A figure frozen in time, standing tall in polished armor, riding confidently beneath banners that flutter in the wind. This image has been repeated so often that it feels almost natural to associate knighthood with glory, purpose, and admiration. It suggests a life chosen freely, guided by honor, and rewarded with respect. But the medieval world did not create knights to be admired. It created them to be used. The dream of knighthood did not begin with the individual. It began with society. In a world built on hierarchy, land ownership, and constant conflict, knights were necessary. They were tools of enforcement, protection, and expansion. The romantic language came later, layered over a reality that was far more demanding and far less forgiving. For boys born into families tied to the lower nobility, the path toward knighthood often felt inevitable. These families rarely had enough land or wealth to support multiple heirs. The eldest son might inherit, but younger sons needed another way to survive. Knighthood offered structure, identity, and at least the promise of food and shelter. It was not presented as a question of desire, but of practicality. As children, these boys heard stories told by adults who had never lived the life themselves. Tales of bravery and loyalty were passed down beside warm fires, softened by distance and repetition. The fear and exhaustion were left out. What remained was a vision of purpose, a belief that suffering could be transformed into something meaningful. By the age of 7, the dream began to harden into reality. Boys were sent away from home to serve as pages in the households of powerful lords. For many, this separation came suddenly. Familiar voices were replaced by strict rules. Comfort gave way to discipline. Childhood ended quietly, without ceremony. Life as a page was repetitive and demanding. Days were filled with service rather than learning. Carrying messages, cleaning rooms, tending to horses, and standing silently for hours became normal. Mistakes were corrected quickly and often harshly. Praise was rare. Obedience was expected. From the very beginning, boys learned that their value lay in usefulness, not individuality. What made this stage especially heavy was the lack of choice. A child could not leave. He could not decide to rest. He could not imagine another future. The path forward had already been decided, stretching far beyond what he could understand. Even at this young age, knighthood was already asking for sacrifice. As years passed, the body adapted. The mind followed. Pain became familiar. Fatigue settled in as a constant presence. The boy grew taller, stronger, and quieter. By the time he became a squire, serving directly under a knight, The dream of knighthood had already cost him years of freedom and comfort. And yet, the dream survived. It survived because it offered something powerful in a harsh world: identity. Knighthood told the young man who he was, where he belonged, and why his suffering mattered. It turned hardship into duty and fear into purpose. Without that belief, the weight of the path might have been unbearable. But the dream was incomplete. It spoke only of what knighthood promised, not of what it demanded. It did not prepare a young man for the physical toll, the constant fear, the loss of control, or the quiet realization that glory was rare and forgetfulness was common. The dream of knighthood was convincing, but it was also misleading. And once a man stepped fully into that role, there was no easy way to step back out. This was only the beginning. Because as the dream faded, the body began to pay the price. Chapter 2: Childhood Training and the Loss of Innocence. The path to knighthood did not begin with swords or armor. It began with something far more subtle: the erosion of childhood itself. At the age of 7, a boy destined to become a knight would leave behind the comforts of his home, his family, and his familiar world. This was not a choice he made. It was a decision made for him. He was sent to serve as a page, an apprentice in a system that demanded immediate obedience and sacrifice. From that moment on, his life was not his own. It belonged to a lord or a master who would shape him, not as an individual, but as a tool of war. The world around him changed immediately and drastically. The warmth of family, the quiet comfort of home, and the easy companionship of childhood were replaced with the rigid structure of service, discipline, and expectation. In the household of a noble lord, the boy was surrounded by men and women who had long abandoned their own childhoods, all of them immersed in the same unforgiving world. The pages were not treated with softness, but with a strictness that left no room for weakness. A mistake in serving a meal, in preparing armor, or in carrying out orders could result in punishment. These were not small mistakes either. Even something as minor as being caught distracted during a task could invite the cold, unyielding hand of discipline. But the training went beyond mere tasks. It went straight to the heart of the child's identity. From a young age, the future knight was taught that his worth would be measured by his strength, his obedience, and his ability to endure. Fear, doubt, or hesitation were not tolerated. To show weakness was to risk losing respect, to risk becoming less than a man in the eyes of the world. Imagine, then, the mind of a 7-year-old boy arriving at the household of a great lord, unsure of where to go, unsure of what to do. There, surrounded by warriors who seemed larger than life, he began to understand the first lesson of his new world. There was no room for softness. His emotions were secondary to his duty. Fear was something to be buried, and pain was to be endured. His days as a page were long and monotonous. While the young lord's sons studied the ways of the knight, the page was expected to serve without question. His tasks ranged from the menial to the mundane: polishing swords, delivering messages, tending to the horses, and standing at attention during meetings. These were not the tasks of a boy imagining adventure or heroism. They were the tasks of someone learning how to be invisible, how to be useful, how to disappear into the shadow of greater men. And it was in this shadow that the page's identity began to shift. The more time he spent in the world of knights, the more he began to see his own childhood as something distant, something unimportant. The boy who once laughed freely with his siblings now found himself learning how to carry himself with seriousness, with discipline, and with a quiet confidence that would eventually become a mask. But what the page did not understand, and what he could not possibly have known, was the cost of this transformation. As the days passed and the years wore on, his childhood was slowly, silently stripped away. The carefree joys of youth were replaced by a sense of constant responsibility, and a feeling of always being on duty. The page learned to obey without question, to serve without hesitation. But what was lost in this transformation was something far more valuable than any lesson he could learn from the sword. The innocence of childhood, The ability to feel joy without fear of consequence, to play without the weight of responsibility, began to disappear. Every day that passed, the page became less of a child and more of the man he was destined to be. But in that process, something precious slipped away. There were no more carefree days spent with friends. No more moments of play without purpose. The page was no longer allowed to wander in fields or climb trees. He was expected to behave as an adult, to carry the weight of knighthood before his body was ready to bear it. In time, the boy would grow into a squire and begin the true training that would shape him into a knight. But even as he advanced, the lessons learned during his childhood as a page would never leave him. They would echo in his every action, in his every thought. The belief that obedience was more important than individuality, that survival came through service and pain, would become the foundation of his identity. By the time he reached adulthood, the boy would no longer be capable of seeing life as he once had. The endless tasks, the unspoken rules, the harsh discipline, and the pressure to conform would have shaped him into something he had never dreamed of as a child. He would become a knight, but not a free man. And though he would wear the armor and wield the sword, the question that would follow him always was this: in the pursuit of duty and honor, what had he truly lost along the way? Chapter 3: A Body Forged Through Pain. The transition from childhood to knighthood wasn't just mental, it was physical. The body of a future knight was not shaped by choice, but by necessity. From the very first moments of training, a knight's body was molded to endure, to fight, and to survive. It was not a process of gradual improvement, but one of constant breaking down and rebuilding, a slow, painful forging that began long before the battlefield. From the age of 14, the boy who had once been a page was thrust into the world of a squire, and his body began to undergo rigorous training. Each day was spent learning to fight, to ride, to carry heavy armor, and to withstand the physical toll of battle. The training was relentless, designed to harden both muscle and spirit. No time was given for rest, no space allowed for injury to heal properly. If a knight could endure the training, he would be prepared for the horrors of war. If he could not, he would be discarded. Imagine the exhaustion that came with these early years of training. Hours upon hours of swordplay, each swing intended to build strength and precision. The body was constantly under strain. Muscles burned from repetition, bones ached from the weight of armor, and blisters covered hands that were taught to grip with an unyielding force. Every movement was designed to build endurance, but it was impossible to know how much the body could truly endure until it reached its limits. And it often did. In the early years, injuries were frequent. A twisted ankle from horseback riding, a bruise from a poorly blocked sword strike, a torn muscle from an incorrectly executed move, these were common occurrences. But the concept of taking it easy was foreign to the training. No matter the injury, knights were expected to push through it. A sprained wrist could be taped and forgotten. A wound could be quickly patched and bandaged, only to reopen the next day in practice. The toll on the body was constant and unforgiving. Knights did not have the luxury of modern medical care. They relied on crude methods for healing, bandages, salves, and sometimes even bloodletting. Infections from untreated wounds spread quickly, and many knights died not in glorious battle, but from infections that could have been prevented. If a knight could not perform after an injury, he was seen as weak, unworthy of his position. It was a harsh standard, and the pressure to comply was immense. Imagine the mental strain that accompanied this physical pain. There was no time to acknowledge suffering, to pause and reflect. A knight in training was expected to soldier through. The idea of injury as something to be healed with rest was replaced by the belief that only through pain could strength be achieved. The body was a vessel that needed to be forged in fire, shaped by suffering. This belief permeated every aspect of a knight's training, and it was ingrained deeply, even in the youngest of boys. As the years wore on, the physical cost of knighthood became more apparent. By the time a squire was fully ready to be knighted, His body had undergone years of grueling training, and it showed. His hands were calloused, his body weathered, and his mind sharp from constant focus on survival. But even as he stood ready to take on the mantle of a knight, the toll on his body could not be undone. He was physically altered, not just by the scars and wounds of training, but by the slow erosion of his youth. The pain that marked a knight's body was often invisible to others. The tightness in his back from carrying armor for years. The chronic pain in his knees from hours spent on horseback. The dull ache in his wrists from wielding a sword too many times. But these pains were not things a knight could complain about. They were the price of his service, the proof that he had survived, that he had earned his place in the world. But even when knights reached their full potential, when they stood at the height of their physical strength, there was still the weight of the armor they carried. The armor that both protected and restricted. It was heavy, sometimes too heavy. Full plate armor weighed upwards of 50 pounds, and knights were expected to wear it for hours at a time. The metal could rub against the skin, causing chafing and sores. In battle, this weight could tire even the most skilled warrior, making every movement feel sluggish and slow. And then there was the toll of combat itself. Fighting in armor was an exhausting, brutal task. Even the best trained knight could be overwhelmed by the sheer physicality of battle. Sword strikes that never quite landed, shields that were too heavy to hold steady, the constant strain of staying upright in the heat of battle. The knight's body was pushed to the limit during every skirmish, every charge, every swing of the sword. Each battle left its mark on the body, not only in cuts and bruises but in the wear and tear on the joints, the muscles, the bones. The idea that knighthood was a path of glory, strength, and honor was a lie, at least in the way it was presented to the public. The reality was that being a knight was about enduring pain, about withstanding suffering, about surviving against all odds. And for most knights, the pain never truly stopped. It was a constant companion, following them through training, into battle, and often into the rest of their lives. When the battles ended, when the armor was set aside, and when the knight was left alone to live out his days, the effects of all that pain became even clearer. The injuries, the scars, the long hours of practice, they all added up. And the body that had been forged through pain would now have to face the consequences of that training. The knight's body may have been strong, but it was never truly free from the cost of its strength. Chapter 4. Living with Fear Every Day. Fear was not something that arrived suddenly on the battlefield. It did not appear only in moments of violence or chaos. For a medieval knight, fear was woven quietly into everyday life, settling in long before armor was worn or swords were drawn. It lived in anticipation, in uncertainty, and in the constant awareness that danger could appear without warning. From the earliest days of training, knights learned that fear was unacceptable if it was visible. A boy who hesitated, flinched, or showed doubt was corrected quickly. Fear itself was not denied, but it was never discussed openly. Instead, it was buried beneath discipline and repetition. Over time, this suppression became instinctive. Knights learned to move forward even when fear was present, to act while their minds raced with uncertainty. Even in times of peace, knights were rarely at ease. The medieval world was unstable, shaped by shifting alliances, sudden conflicts, and the ever-present threat of violence. Travel alone was dangerous. Roads were poorly maintained, forests were filled with bandits, and villages could turn hostile without notice. A knight riding between estates could be ambushed at any moment, and many were. For this reason, armor was often worn even when battle was not expected. Knights slept with weapons nearby, sometimes even sleeping partially armored. Rest was never complete. The body might lie still, but the mind remained alert, listening for movement, waiting for danger. True relaxation was rare, and when it came, it was often brief. The battlefield itself was the place where fear revealed its full weight. Contrary to romantic depictions, battles were not orderly displays of courage. They were loud, confusing, and deeply frightening. Dust filled the air. Shouts overlapped. Orders were lost in the noise. A knight often had little idea of what was happening beyond a few steps in front of him. In these moments, fear sharpened the senses but also overwhelmed them. Vision narrowed. Sounds became distorted. Time seemed to slow and speed up all at once. The body reacted before the mind could fully process what was happening. Survival depended not on bravery, but on instinct and luck. Death was never distant. A single misstep could mean disaster. A loose strap, a cracked shield, or a moment of distraction could expose a knight to fatal injury. Even the strongest armor had weak points. Blades slipped through gaps. Blunt weapons crushed bones beneath metal. Horses fell, trapping riders beneath them in moments of chaos. What made this fear especially heavy was its unpredictability. Knights could survive countless battles only to die days later from an infected wound. Others were struck down by arrows fired from unseen positions. Some were captured rather than killed, facing imprisonment, ransom, or execution. Survival did not depend solely on skill or courage. Chance played an enormous role. After battle, fear did not simply disappear. It lingered in the body and mind. Many nights found sleep difficult. Memories returned uninvited, sounds of metal clashing, the cries of wounded men, the sudden silence after violence. These memories had no name, no explanation. There was no concept of trauma, no understanding that the mind itself could be wounded. Yet knights were expected to carry this weight silently. To speak openly of fear was to risk being seen as weak. And weakness was dangerous in a profession that depended on trust and reputation. So knights learned to keep their fear to themselves, letting it settle quietly into the background of their lives. Religion offered some comfort. Many knights believed their fate was guided by a higher power. This belief helped transform fear into acceptance. If death came, it was God's will. If survival followed, it was a sign of divine favor. Faith did not erase fear, but it gave it meaning. Still, faith could not silence the mind completely. The awareness of mortality followed knights everywhere. It shaped how they spoke, how they watched others, how they moved through the world. Every decision carried weight. Every journey carried risk. Every battle might be the last. To live as a medieval knight was to wake each day knowing that life could end suddenly, and without ceremony. There were no guarantees of glory, no promise of remembrance. Only the certainty that fear was always present, waiting quietly, just beneath the surface. And as heavy as fear was, it was only one part of a deeper burden. Because beyond fear, there was something even more difficult to accept, the complete loss of control over one's own life. Chapter 5. Obedience, Lords, and the Loss of Freedom. For all the strength a knight was expected to show, one truth remained quietly undeniable. A medieval knight was never truly free. His armor, his weapons, and his title did not grant independence. They bound him more tightly to a system that demanded obedience above all else. From the moment a knight swore his oath, his life became anchored to a lord. This bond was not symbolic or ceremonial. It was practical, immediate, and absolute. A knight's time, body, and skills belonged to someone else, and that ownership extended far beyond the battlefield. Orders did not arrive with explanations. A knight was rarely told why he was being sent somewhere or what larger purpose his actions served. He was told when to ride, where to go, and whom to fight. To question these commands was dangerous. Doubt could be interpreted as disloyalty, and disloyalty could destroy a knight's standing entirely. This obedience shaped daily life. Knights lived where they were assigned, often far from home and for long stretches of time. Months could pass without seeing family or familiar places. Communication was slow and unreliable. Letters were rare, and news often arrived long after events had passed. A knight learned to accept separation as normal, even when it weighed heavily on him. Freedom of movement did not exist in the way we understand it today. A knight could not simply decide to leave service or pursue a different life. His training, identity, and reputation were all tied to his role. To abandon it meant disgrace, poverty, or worse. Even when service became unbearable, endurance was often the only option. Financial independence was also an illusion. Maintaining the appearance of knighthood was expensive. Armor required constant repair. Horses needed food, care, and replacement. Weapons had to be kept in working condition. Many knights spent more than they earned simply to remain presentable. Payment for service was inconsistent, and rewards were uncertain. A knight who lost favor with his lord faced a rapid decline. Without protection or income, his position collapsed quickly. Land grants could be revoked. Opportunities disappeared. Reputation, once damaged, was nearly impossible to repair. In a society built on hierarchy and trust, standing mattered more than skill. Marriage, too, was often shaped by obligation rather than choice. Knights were frequently expected to marry for political or economic reasons. Alliances mattered more than affection. Love, if it appeared at all, was something that developed slowly or not at all. A knight's personal happiness was secondary to duty. Even moments of rest were shaped by expectation. A knight was never entirely off duty. He was always representing his lord, his family, and his oath. His behavior was observed. His words mattered. Mistakes carried consequences far beyond personal embarrassment. Imagine the quiet weight of this existence. A knight who has trained since childhood, endured pain and fear, now realizing that even adulthood offers little control. His path stretches forward without flexibility, shaped by forces he cannot influence. The world praises his strength, yet denies him choice. Some knights accepted this reality fully, finding meaning in loyalty itself. Others struggled quietly, carrying resentment they never voiced. But all understood the same truth: knighthood demanded surrender. This loss of freedom did not end on the battlefield. It followed knights into every corner of their lives, shaping decisions they never truly made for themselves. And perhaps the hardest realization of all was this: even after all this sacrifice, there was no guarantee of recognition or reward. Because for most knights, glory remained distant, and forgetting came easily. Chapter 6: Daily Life Between Wars. Most of a medieval knight's life was not spent charging into battle or clashing swords beneath open skies. Instead, it unfolded in the long, quiet stretches between conflicts, periods rarely mentioned in stories, yet heavy with monotony, discomfort, and unease. These were the days that truly defined knighthood, not moments of glory, but months and years of waiting. When war was absent, knights were still expected to remain ready. Readiness was not a feeling, it was a state of existence. Armor had to be maintained, weapons sharpened, horses trained, and the body kept strong. There was no clear boundary between work and rest. Every day carried the understanding that violence could return without warning. A knight might wake before dawn in a cold stone hall, the air damp and heavy. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. The floor beneath his feet was hard, and sleep had been shallow. He rose not because he felt rested, but because routine demanded it. The day began with simple tasks: checking equipment, feeding horses, walking the grounds, repetitive actions that filled the hours and kept the body moving. Training never truly ended. Even outside of war, knights practiced daily. Sword drills, sparring, riding exercises, these routines were as much about discipline as skill. Muscles ached constantly, never fully recovering. Injuries lingered. Old wounds stiffened in the cold. Yet stopping was not an option. To fall behind meant risking usefulness, and usefulness defined survival. Between training sessions there was often little to do but wait. Knights stood guard on walls, escorted travelers, or watched over land they did not own. These duties were rarely dangerous, but they were draining in their own way. Long hours passed slowly. Time stretched. The mind wandered. It was during these quiet moments that doubts often surfaced. Without the urgency of battle, knights were left alone with their thoughts. They thought about years already spent in service, about injuries that never healed, about futures that remained uncertain. There was no guarantee that loyalty would be rewarded, or that survival would bring comfort. Entertainment was limited. Reading was rare. Music, when present, was simple. Conversation filled some hours, but even that was shaped by hierarchy. Knights spoke carefully, aware of who might be listening. Laughter existed, but it was restrained. Nothing felt fully relaxed. Food was often plain and repetitive. Bread, stew, salted meat, meals meant to sustain rather than delight. Hunger was common, especially in poorer households or during lean seasons. Knights were not immune to scarcity. Despite their status, many lived close to the edge, dependent on the resources of their lord. Weather added another layer of discomfort. Cold seeped into stone walls during winter. Rain turned courtyards into mud. Heat became suffocating in summer armor. There was little relief. Knights adapted, but adaptation did not mean comfort. Horses required constant care. A knight's mount was both companion and tool, and its health mattered deeply. Feeding, grooming, and training horses filled many hours. Injuries to a horse could be disastrous, leaving a knight vulnerable and dependent on others. Even in moments of rest, vigilance remained. Castles and estates were not safe havens. Raids, rebellions, and surprise attacks were always possible. Guards rotated constantly. Sleep was light. Weapons stayed close. Imagine the quiet of a late evening. The courtyard is dim. A few torches flicker. A knight sits alone, armor set aside, hands resting on scarred knees. The silence is heavy. He is not at peace. He is simply between moments of action. This waiting wore on the spirit. The body was built for movement and purpose, yet the mind was left to drift. Some knights grew restless. Others became withdrawn. A few sought distraction in drink or reckless behavior, brief attempts to escape monotony. Daily life between wars revealed the true nature of knighthood. It was not an endless series of heroic moments, but a slow, grinding existence defined by preparation, boredom, discomfort, and uncertainty. The stories remembered the battles. They forgot the waiting. And waiting, for many knights, was the hardest part of all. Because even when war finally returned, it did not bring relief. It brought something far worse. Chapter 7: Hunger, Cold, and Constant Discomfort. One of the greatest misunderstandings about medieval knights is the belief that status protected them from hardship. Armor and titles did not guarantee warmth, comfort, or even regular meals. In reality, knights lived much closer to discomfort than to luxury, and hunger and cold were frequent companions throughout their lives. Food, when it was available, was rarely abundant. Even knights depended on the stability of harvests, trade routes, and their lord's resources. During lean seasons, rations were reduced. Bread grew stale. Meat became scarce. Meals were meant to sustain the body, not satisfy it. Hunger settled quietly into daily life, becoming a dull, persistent presence rather than an emergency. A knight might eat once or twice a day, often the same simple foods repeated endlessly. Stews thickened with grain, salted meat that required soaking, coarse bread that filled the stomach but offered little nourishment. Fresh food was a luxury, not a certainty. During campaigns or long journeys, meals became even more unpredictable. Hunger sharpened tempers and drained energy, making already difficult tasks feel heavier. Cold was equally unforgiving. Castles, despite their imposing stone walls, were poorly insulated. Wind slipped through cracks. Dampness settled into bones. Fires were expensive and carefully managed, rarely burning through the night. A knight learned to sleep in layers, wrapped in cloaks that offered only partial protection from the chill. Winter was especially harsh. Armor grew icy to the touch. Metal leached warmth from the body. Fingers stiffened, making even simple tasks difficult. Horses suffered too, requiring extra care while resources were already strained. The cold was not dramatic or sudden, it was slow, constant, and exhausting. Even during warmer months, comfort remained elusive. Summer heat trapped inside armor caused sweat to pool beneath metal plates and chainmail. Chafing and sores developed quickly. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp leather lingered. Bathing was rare, and privacy rarer still. Sleep offered little relief. Beds were simple, often nothing more than straw mattresses or wooden benches. Rest was shallow, interrupted by cold, noise, or the need to stand watch. A knight rarely slept deeply, and fatigue accumulated slowly over years. Clothing beneath armor wore out quickly. Repairs were constant. A torn tunic or worn boots could cause serious discomfort during long marches. Ill-fitting gear rubbed skin raw. Yet replacements were expensive and not always available. Discomfort became normal. Knights stopped expecting ease. Pain, hunger, cold, and exhaustion blended into the background of existence. Complaining was pointless. Everyone endured the same conditions, and endurance was seen as a measure of worth. Imagine waking before dawn, stomach hollow, breath visible in the cold air, armor cold against the skin. The day stretches ahead, filled with tasks that demand energy the body does not have. And yet, the night rises and continues, because stopping is not an option. This constant discomfort shaped the knight's character. It hardened him, but it also wore him down. Over time, small hardships accumulated, creating a life defined not by single moments of suffering, but by unending strain. And when war finally arrived, it did not interrupt this discomfort. It intensified it. Chapter 8: Equipment, Armor, and Endless Maintenance. To the outside world, a knight's armor appeared as a symbol of power and protection. Polished metal reflected sunlight. Helmets and shields gave the impression of invincibility. But for the knight who wore it, armor was less a symbol and more a constant responsibility, one that demanded time, money, and attention long before it ever offered protection. Armor was never simply worn. It was carried, cleaned, repaired, adjusted, and worried over endlessly. A knight's survival depended on it, yet it was also one of the greatest burdens of his daily life. Metal rusted easily. Leather dried, cracked, and rotted. Straps loosened. Buckles bent. A single weak point could mean serious injury or death, so nothing could be ignored. Maintenance filled countless hours. After training or patrol, armor had to be cleaned of sweat, dirt, and moisture. If it was left unattended, rust formed quickly, eating into metal and weakening it. Knights often spent evenings wiping plates, oiling chain mail, and checking every strap by hand. These tasks were repetitive and exhausting, yet absolutely necessary. Armor was also expensive. Very few knights could afford a full, perfectly fitted set. Many pieces were inherited, borrowed, or patched together over time. Helmets might not fit perfectly. Armor might rub or restrict movement. Knights adapted their bodies to the equipment rather than the other way around, enduring discomfort because replacement was rarely an option. Weapons required equal attention. Swords needed sharpening. Blades chipped. Hilts loosened. A dull weapon was dangerous not only to enemies, but to the knight himself. Shields cracked under repeated blows and had to be repaired or reinforced. Spears broke. Lances splintered. Nothing lasted forever, and everything demanded care. Horses, too, were part of this burden. A knight's mount was as essential as his armor, yet maintaining a horse required food, shelter, grooming, and constant vigilance. Illness or injury could render a horse useless, forcing a knight to walk or rely on others. Losing a horse was more than inconvenience. It could mean vulnerability or disgrace. Imagine the quiet frustration of preparing for battle, knowing that your armor is worn thin in places, your sword less sharp than you'd like, your horse limping slightly from an old injury. You know these weaknesses could cost your life, yet you have no way to fix them fully. You march forward anyway. Even during times of peace, the burden never lifted. Equipment could not be set aside and forgotten. Rust did not wait for war. Leather did not pause its decay. A knight lived in constant awareness of his tools, knowing they required as much attention as his own body. Armor also changed how a knight moved through the world. Wearing it limited vision, restricted breathing, and amplified fatigue. Simple actions, mounting a horse, climbing stairs, turning quickly, required effort and care. The armor that protected also confined, shaping posture and movement until it became second nature. Over time, the constant maintenance became part of daily life, a quiet ritual that filled hours without recognition. No songs were sung about cleaning armor. No legends told of sharpening blades by candlelight. Yet this work was as essential to knighthood as any battle. The tools of war were not passive objects. They demanded loyalty, attention, and sacrifice. They reminded knights daily that survival depended not only on courage, but on preparation and care. And despite all this effort, armor could still fail. Because when battle came, equipment was tested beyond its limits. Chapter 9: The Reality of Medieval Battles. The idea of battle, as imagined from a distance, was far cleaner than its reality. Songs spoke of clear lines, heroic charges, and moments of decisive bravery. Paintings showed knights standing tall, banners waving, faces determined. But when battle truly arrived, it brought confusion rather than clarity, fear rather than certainty, and exhaustion rather than glory. A medieval battle rarely began with a single dramatic moment. It often unfolded slowly, painfully, through hours or even days of movement, waiting, and uncertainty. Knights marched long distances before ever seeing an enemy. Armor weighed heavily during these marches, draining strength before combat even began. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue were already present when the first blows were struck. As armies drew closer, tension settled over everything. The air felt heavier. Conversations grew quieter. Horses sensed unease and shifted restlessly. A knight checked his equipment again and again, tightening straps, adjusting his grip, aware that once the fighting began, there would be no time to fix mistakes. When battle finally erupted, it did not follow a neat pattern. Orders were shouted, but often lost in the noise. Dust rose from the ground, mixing with smoke and obscuring vision. The sound was overwhelming, metal striking metal, horses screaming, men shouting in pain or fear. It was impossible to take everything in at once. A knight rarely saw the battle as a whole. His world shrank to a small, frantic space around him. The enemy directly ahead. The weight of armor pressing down. The struggle to breathe. Awareness narrowed, focused entirely on survival. Everything beyond arm's reach became distant and unreal. Movement was difficult. Armor restricted speed. The ground was uneven, slippery with mud, blood, or fallen bodies. A single misstep could mean falling, and falling in battle was extremely dangerous. A knight on the ground was vulnerable, struggling to rise under the weight of metal while others fought above him. Weapons struck with terrifying force. Swords rang against shields. Blunt weapons crushed through armor, breaking bones even when metal held firm. Spears thrust unexpectedly from gaps in the crowd. Arrows fell without warning, fired from unseen positions. There was no safe place. Horses added another layer of danger. They panicked easily amid noise and chaos. A frightened horse could rear, bolt, or fall, throwing its rider violently to the ground. Knights trained for years to fight from horseback, yet many died beneath their own mounts. Fear was constant and unavoidable. Even the most experienced knights felt it. Courage did not mean the absence of fear. It meant acting while fear flooded the body. Hands shook. Breathing grew ragged. Vision blurred with sweat and dust. Time seemed distorted. Moments stretched endlessly, then vanished in an instant. Death was rarely quick or clean. Wounds were messy and painful. Men screamed for help that did not come. Others fell silently and were trampled without notice. The battlefield was not a place of honor. It was a place of survival. As the fighting dragged on, exhaustion became overwhelming. Armor felt heavier with each movement. Muscles burned. The mind grew dull. Decisions slowed. Many knights reached a point where they fought on instinct alone, barely aware of their surroundings. Victory, when it came, brought little relief. The field was littered with bodies. The wounded cried out. Friends lay motionless. The air smelled of blood, sweat, and smoke. There was no celebration in these moments, only silence and disbelief. Defeat was worse. Retreat often turned into chaos. Knights fled, stumbling through unfamiliar terrain, shedding armor to escape faster. Capture was common. Those taken prisoner faced ransom, imprisonment, or death. Survival after battle was uncertain even for those who escaped. And even for those who lived, the battle did not truly end. Injuries lingered. Memories followed. The sounds and images returned in dreams and quiet moments. There was no time to process what had happened. Another march, another order, another fight might come soon. Medieval battles were not moments of glory preserved in time. They were chaotic, brutal experiences that left deep marks on those who survived. Knights did not emerge triumphant and proud. They emerged exhausted, injured, and changed. And many did not emerge at all. The reality of battle stripped away any remaining illusion of knighthood. It revealed the truth beneath the armor, a human being pushed to the limits of endurance in a world that demanded everything and gave very little back. Chapter 10: Injury, Infection, and Slow Death. Surviving a battle did not mean safety. For many medieval knights, the most dangerous part of war began only after the fighting stopped. Wounds that seemed minor in the chaos of combat could become fatal days later. In a world without modern medicine, injury carried a quiet, lingering threat that followed knights long after they left the battlefield. Cuts and punctures were common. Armor protected against some blows, but no armor was perfect. Blades slipped through gaps. Arrows found exposed flesh. Blunt weapons crushed bone beneath metal. In the moment, adrenaline dulled pain, allowing knights to keep fighting. But once the battle ended and the body began to settle, pain arrived fully, heavy and unavoidable. Medical treatment was crude and uncertain. Surgeons, when present at all, relied on limited knowledge. Wounds were cleaned with water or wine, stitched roughly, and wrapped with cloth that was rarely sterile. The concept of infection was poorly understood. When wounds became red, swollen, or foul-smelling, it was often too late. Infections spread quickly. A small cut could turn deadly within days. Fever followed. Weakness set in. Knights who had survived swords and arrows found themselves helpless against illness they could not fight. Many died slowly, weakened by fever and pain, far from home and family. Broken bones posed another danger. A fractured limb might heal crooked or not at all. Pain lingered for life. Mobility was reduced. A knight who could no longer ride or fight effectively risked losing his place entirely. Injury did not only threaten life, it threatened identity. Amputation was sometimes attempted as a last resort. Without anesthesia, it was brutal and terrifying. Survival was uncertain. Many died from shock or infections soon after. Those who lived were permanently altered, often unable to continue as knights. Even lesser injuries accumulated over time. Repeated blows weakened joints. Old wounds reopened. Scars tightened skin and restricted movement. The body remembered every injury, carrying them forward year after year. Pain became constant. Some knights lived with it daily, accepting it as normal. Others sought relief in alcohol or distraction. Few spoke openly about suffering. To complain was to admit weakness in a world that valued strength above all else. Imagine a knight sitting quietly after battle, armor removed, hands trembling as he examines a wound that will not heal properly. He knows what may come. Fever. Weakness. A slow fading. There is little he can do but wait. Death, when it arrived this way, was not heroic. It came in silence, in tense or cold rooms, far from banners and songs. Many knights died without witnesses, their last moments unnoticed by the world they had served. Survival after injury also brought consequences. A knight who lived might never fully recover. He might limp, struggle to lift his sword, or tire easily. His usefulness declined. And with it, his security. The medieval world offered little mercy to those who could no longer fight. Injury marked the beginning of decline. For many knights, it was the first step toward irrelevance. And yet, even injury was not the end of suffering. Because some knights survived battle only to lose something even more precious: their freedom. Chapter 11: Captivity, Ransom, and Humiliation. For a medieval knight, defeat did not always mean death. Often, it meant something far more drawn out and unsettling: captivity. To be captured in battle was not uncommon, especially among knights whose armor marked them as valuable. Survival in these moments came at a price, one paid not only in coin, but in dignity, fear, and uncertainty. When a knight was taken prisoner, his fate shifted immediately into the hands of others. He was stripped of weapons, armor, and symbols of status. The metal that once protected him was taken away, sometimes violently, leaving him exposed and powerless. The transformation from warrior to captive happened quickly and without ceremony. Captivity was rarely comfortable. Prisoners were confined to rooms, cells, or makeshift enclosures. Conditions varied widely, but comfort was never guaranteed. Some knights were treated with a measure of respect, especially if their ransom promised wealth. Others were neglected, threatened, or mistreated. Everything depended on the captor's character and circumstances. Ransom was both a hope and a burden. A knight's value was measured in money, land, or favors. Negotiations could take months or even years. During this time, the captive lived in limbo, uncertain whether freedom would ever come. Families struggled to raise funds. Lords weighed the cost of recovery against usefulness. Not every knight was worth the expense. The waiting was often the hardest part. Days passed slowly. Time lost its structure. The captive knight was no longer defined by action, but by inaction. He waited for messages, for negotiations, for decisions made far away. Every sound outside his confinement carried possibility. Every silence deepened uncertainty. Humiliation was constant. Once proud knights depended on their captors for food, warmth, and permission to move. They were watched, restricted, and reminded daily of their powerlessness. This loss of control cut deeply into identity, especially for men raised to equate worth with strength and authority. Even when ransom was paid, freedom did not always restore what was lost. Some knights returned home deeply changed. The experience of captivity lingered, shaping how they viewed the world. Trust became difficult. Confidence wavered. The memory of helplessness followed them long after chains were removed. For those whose ransom was never paid, captivity could stretch indefinitely. Some were forced into service. Others died quietly in confinement, forgotten as priorities shifted elsewhere. Their stories ended not with heroic death, but with slow erasure. Capture revealed a truth knighthood rarely acknowledged: strength could vanish in an instant. Armor, training, and reputation meant nothing once freedom was taken. In captivity, knights confronted a version of themselves stripped of power, forced to exist without the role that had defined them. This experience shattered many illusions. It exposed the fragile nature of status and the conditional value of loyalty. Knights learned that survival did not guarantee dignity, and freedom was never secure. And when they returned, if they returned at all, another burden awaited them. Because beyond captivity lay something quieter, yet just as heavy: the weight of faith, guilt, and judgment. Religion, guilt, and fear of judgment. In the medieval world, faith was not separate from daily life. It was woven into every decision, every fear, and every hope. For knights, religion offered comfort and meaning, but it also carried a heavy weight. Belief did not simply promise salvation. It demanded constant self-examination, obedience, and an awareness of judgment that followed knights wherever they went. From childhood, future knights were taught that their lives unfolded under the watchful eyes of God. Every action mattered. Every choice carried spiritual consequences. Victory and survival were often interpreted as signs of divine favor, while defeat and suffering were seen as tests or punishments. This belief shaped how knights understood both success and failure. Before battle, prayers were said. Blessings were given. Knights knelt in armor, asking for protection, forgiveness, and strength. These moments were quiet and solemn, offering brief calm before violence. Faith gave knights a way to face fear, turning uncertainty into something purposeful. If death came, it was not random. It was part of a larger plan. Yet faith also brought guilt. Knights were warriors in a religion that valued peace, mercy, and humility. This contradiction was never fully resolved. Killing was justified through duty, but the act itself weighed heavily on the conscience. Many knights carried memories of faces they had struck down, wondering how those actions would be judged beyond this life. Confession offered relief, but it was temporary. Sins could be spoken, prayers said, penance performed. Still, doubt lingered. Had they done enough? Had they gone too far? The line between righteous violence and sinful action was thin and often unclear. Religion also reinforced obedience. Lords ruled by divine right. Authority was presented as sacred. To disobey a lord was not just social rebellion, but spiritual failure. This belief made resistance difficult, even when commands felt unjust or cruel. Fear of judgment extended beyond death. Illness, injury, and misfortune were often interpreted as signs of spiritual failing. A knight wounded repeatedly might wonder whether God was displeased. Survival did not always bring comfort. Sometimes it raised questions that had no easy answers. Imagine a knight alone at night, candles burning low, armor resting nearby. He reflects on his life, the battles fought, the men killed, the orders followed without question. He wonders how these moments will be weighed. There is no certainty, only faith and hope. Some knights embraced religious devotion deeply, seeking solace in prayer and ritual. Others struggled quietly, their belief complicated by experience. Faith sustained them, but it also reminded them constantly of their own imperfection. In the end, religion offered both refuge and burden. It helped knights endure fear and suffering, yet it also deepened their awareness of guilt and judgment. It framed their lives within a story larger than themselves, even when that story was difficult to accept. And as knights aged, as strength faded and memories accumulated, these questions grew louder. Because beyond faith and battle awaited another challenge, the slow realization that time itself was turning against them. Chapter 13: Aging, Irrelevance, and Quiet Decline. For a medieval knight, aging was not marked by celebration or reflection. It arrived quietly, carried in small changes that were easy to ignore at first. A little stiffness in the morning, a slightly slower rise from the saddle, a soreness that lingered longer than it once had. There was no clear moment when a knight became old. There was only the gradual realization that the body was no longer keeping pace with expectation. Years of training, battle, hunger, cold, and injury accumulated slowly. The body remembered every blow it had taken, every fall, every night spent sleeping poorly on hard ground. Joints stiffened. Old wounds ached constantly. Muscles that had once responded quickly now tired easily. Recovery took longer, if it came at all. Yet the expectations placed upon a knight did not fade with age. The world did not slow down simply because his body did. Younger men continued to train harder, ride faster, and fight with fresher strength. The knight who had once been admired now found himself quietly compared to those who came after him. This comparison was rarely spoken aloud, but it was felt. In training yards, younger knights sparred with greater speed. On long rides, they recovered more quickly. In battle preparations, they were chosen first for difficult tasks. The older knight was still respected, but usefulness mattered more than memory. There was a quiet fear in this transition. A knight understood that his value had always been tied to what he could do. When strength faded, identity weakened. Without battle readiness, what remained? There was no alternate role prepared for him. No ceremony that marked the shift from warrior to elder. He simply became less essential. Some knights were given secondary duties, guarding less important locations, training younger men, escorting caravans instead of leading charges. These roles were meant to be honorable, yet they carried a subtle message: your time at the center has passed. Others were simply overlooked. Summons stopped arriving. Campaigns moved forward without them. The world continued, indifferent to years of loyalty. For men raised to define themselves through service, this fading was deeply unsettling. Imagine a knight watching younger men prepare for war. Their armor shines. Their movements are confident. They speak of battle with excitement mixed with fear. He recognizes himself in them, and yet knows he no longer belongs fully among them. His armor still fits, but it feels heavier than it once did. There was also the fear of replacement. Knights knew they were not unique. For every man who aged out of usefulness, there were others ready to take his place. Training never stopped. New squires arrived every year. The system did not pause for sentiment. Financial insecurity often followed aging. Older knights with injuries or diminished ability struggled to maintain equipment. Income declined. Costs remained. Some were forced to sell pieces of armor or rely on charity. Pride made this difficult to accept. Social standing eroded quietly. Invitations grew fewer. Opinions carried less weight. The knight who once stood confidently among peers now listened more than he spoke. The world did not reject him openly. It simply moved on. This quiet decline was often lonelier than battle. There were no clear enemies to face, no swords to raise. Only time, steadily pulling away strength and certainty. The struggle was internal, unseen by others. Some knights tried to hold on desperately. They trained harder than their bodies allowed. They volunteered for dangerous missions. They pushed themselves beyond reason, unwilling to accept change. This often ended in injury or humiliation, confirming what they feared most. Others accepted decline with resignation. They adjusted expectations, finding small purpose where they could. Teaching, guarding, serving quietly. Acceptance did not remove sadness, but it softened resistance. What made aging especially painful was the absence of reward. Years of sacrifice did not guarantee comfort or honor at the end. There was no promise of peace, only the hope that dignity might remain intact. As strength faded, memory grew louder. Old battles returned in thought. Faces of fallen companions resurfaced. Questions lingered. Had it been worth it? Had anything truly remained? For many knights, this was the hardest phase of all. Not the battles, not the injuries, but the slow realization that their life's defining role was slipping away, and nothing equally meaningful was waiting to replace it. And yet, even in decline, knights were rarely alone, because alongside aging came another burden: The weight of lost companions, broken bonds, and friendships shaped by hardship and loss. Chapter 14: Brotherhood, Loneliness, and Lost Companions. Despite the rigid hierarchy and constant discipline of knighthood, one of the few comforts a knight could find was the presence of others who shared the same burden. Brotherhood formed not through ceremony, but through shared hardship. It grew quietly, in long marches, cold nights, and moments of fear that words could not fully describe. Knights rarely spoke openly about emotions, but bonds formed naturally among those who endured the same trials. Training side by side created familiarity. Fighting together created trust. A knight learned to rely on the man beside him without needing explanation. In battle, this trust could mean survival. Outside of battle, it provided a sense of belonging in a life otherwise shaped by obligation. These friendships were rarely loud or expressive. They were built on shared silence as much as shared conversation. Sitting together after training, cleaning armor by firelight, standing watch through long nights, these moments stitched people together slowly, without ceremony. Yet this brotherhood existed under constant threat. War did not allow bonds to settle comfortably. Companions disappeared suddenly. One day they stood beside you. The next they were gone. A battle, an illness, an ambush, a poorly healed wound. Loss arrived without warning and rarely offered closure. Knights became accustomed to absence. They learned not to ask too many questions when someone failed to return. There was rarely time to mourn properly. Campaigns moved on. Duties continued. Grief was carried quietly, folded into daily routine. Over time, this repeated loss changed how knights connected to others. Some grew distant, reluctant to form deep bonds knowing how easily they could be broken. Others clung tightly to companionship, finding comfort in shared presence even when it hurt to lose it later. Loneliness existed even in crowded places. Castles were full of people, yet true connection was rare. Hierarchy shaped every interaction. Knights spoke carefully with those above them and guardedly with those below. Friendship required equality, and equality was scarce. As knights aged, loneliness often deepened. Younger knights formed bonds among themselves, leaving older ones on the edges. Friends from earlier years were gone, dead, injured, captured, or scattered. Familiar faces became fewer. Memories outnumbered companions. Imagine an aging knight sitting among younger men, listening to conversations that echo his own past. He recognizes the excitement, the fear, the optimism. He wants to warn them, yet knows words would fall flat. Experience cannot be transferred easily. It must be lived. Some knights carried small tokens of lost companions, a worn piece of equipment, a shared story remembered quietly, a habit learned together. These memories became a private form of mourning, a way to honor bonds that history would never record. There were no monuments for most knights. No markers to preserve friendships. When a knight died, his place was filled quickly. Another man took his role. Another set of armor was worn. The system did not pause for remembrance. This impermanence shaped the emotional landscape of knighthood. Bonds were real, but fragile. Companionship mattered deeply, yet never felt secure. Knights learned to live with loss as a constant companion. And perhaps that is why loneliness followed them so persistently. Not because they were always alone, but because everything they grew attached to was temporary. As time passed, knights carried a quiet accumulation of names and faces that no longer existed in the present world. They spoke of them less often. Not because they forgot, but because remembering became heavier with age. Brotherhood offered warmth in a cold life, but it came with a cost. To care deeply was to risk grief. To survive was often to watch others disappear. And eventually, even when a knight survived long enough to return home, he found that companionship did not guarantee belonging. Because the hardest journeys were sometimes the ones that led back to familiar places that no longer felt familiar at all. Chapter 15: Homecoming that never feels like home. For many medieval knights, the idea of home became something distant and uncertain. It existed more clearly in memory than in reality. Years of service pulled them away from familiar places, and when they finally returned, they often discovered that home was no longer what they remembered. Time moved differently for those who left and those who stayed behind. Villages changed slowly, quietly. New faces replaced old ones. Children grew into adults. Elders passed away. Fields shifted hands. Houses were rebuilt or abandoned. A knight returning after years of absence stepped into a place that felt both familiar and strangely foreign. Family relationships were especially difficult. Parents aged. Siblings built lives that did not include the knight. Children sometimes did not recognize the man who was supposed to be their father. Conversations felt awkward. There were long pauses filled with things left unsaid. The knight himself had changed as well. He carried experiences that were difficult to explain and even harder to share. Battles, captivity, loss, fear, these things did not translate easily into everyday conversation. Those at home listened politely, but could not truly understand. And so many knights learned to keep their stories to themselves. Even simple routines felt strange. The quiet of village life contrasted sharply with the constant readiness of military service. Without daily orders, the knight felt restless. Without danger, he felt uneasy. Peace, something long imagined as desirable, felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Some knights tried to settle. They took up small roles in their communities. Guarding, training, advising. These roles provided structure, but rarely satisfaction. The sense of purpose that had once driven them was difficult to replace. Others found themselves drifting, moving from place to place, serving briefly, then leaving again. Home did not feel stable, and neither did service. They existed between worlds, belonging fully to neither. There was also the quiet realization that honor meant little outside the battlefield. In villages, survival mattered more than stories. Fields needed tending. Families needed food. A knight's past sacrifices did not guarantee respect or security. Imagine a knight standing at the edge of a familiar field, remembering himself as a boy running freely through it. The memory feels distant, almost belonging to someone else. The world has moved on, and he has moved with it, but the two no longer align. This disconnection was deeply unsettling. Home was supposed to be a place of rest, a reward for years of service. Instead, it often became a reminder of how much had been lost. Time, relationships, simplicity. For some knights, this realization pushed them back into service, even when their bodies could no longer keep up. War, for all its horrors, offered structure and familiarity. Peace required adjustment they were no longer prepared to make. For others, home became a place of quiet endurance. They lived out their days doing what they could, carrying memories that had nowhere to go. The return home was not a moment of triumph. It was a quiet reckoning. A realization that the life lived in service had created a distance that could not easily be crossed. And yet, beyond personal experience, another transformation was taking place. While knights struggled with fading relevance and uncertain belonging, the stories about them were beginning to change. Their suffering was being reshaped into something easier to admire. Chapter 16. The myth takes shape. As the lives of individual knights faded quietly into memory, something else began to grow in their place. The reality of knighthood, its exhaustion, fear, and quiet losses, slowly transformed into story. Over time, these stories became simpler, cleaner, and far easier to admire than the truth they replaced. This transformation did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, shaped by distance and repetition. Those who had not lived the life found it easier to speak of honor than hardship, of bravery rather than fear. Pain softened when remembered from afar. Loss became noble when time dulled its sharpest edges. Bards and storytellers played an important role in this process. They were not interested in long nights of hunger or the slow decay of the body. They sang of battles won, of heroic charges, of loyalty proven in moments of action. Their stories needed rhythm and resolution. They needed heroes, not tired men burdened by years of endurance. Noble families encouraged this retelling. A romantic image of knighthood served a purpose. It inspired loyalty. It justified war. It gave meaning to sacrifice. To acknowledge the full cost would have made the system harder to sustain. So the truth was shaped gently, trimmed of its discomfort. Written chronicles followed a similar path. They recorded names of battles and leaders, not the countless individuals who filled the ranks. Knights became numbers or symbols rather than people. Their inner lives disappeared entirely. What remained were dates, victories, and simplified narratives that fit neatly onto parchment. As generations passed, these stories hardened into tradition. Children grew up hearing about knights as figures of certainty and courage. The messy reality, fear, doubt, exhaustion, vanished almost entirely. Knighthood became an ideal rather than a lived experience. Even aging knights sometimes participated in this myth-making. For some, it was easier to remember selectively than to confront the full weight of their past. Retelling stories in a gentler form helped transform suffering into something bearable. Pain became proof of worth rather than a burden. The myth also offered comfort to those who never lived the life. It allowed society to admire sacrifice without witnessing its consequences. It turned complex human experiences into symbols that could be celebrated safely from a distance. This process of myth-making did not erase suffering, but it buried it beneath layers of narrative. Over time, the knight ceased to be a person shaped by circumstance and became instead a timeless figure, frozen in armor that never rusted and strength that never faded. Yet beneath every story was a reality that remained unspoken. For each tale of bravery, there were years of waiting. For each heroic death, countless quiet disappearances. For each honored name, many forgotten ones. The myth of knighthood became powerful precisely because it was incomplete. It left out the parts that were hardest to hear. It offered certainty where reality had offered only endurance. And as these stories spread, something else began to happen. The world itself changed. Warfare evolved. Power shifted. New methods replaced old traditions. And the role of the knight, once central, slowly began to lose its place. While legends grew stronger, the living knights found themselves increasingly out of step with the world around them. Chapter 17. The World Moves On Without You. One of the quietest and most unsettling realizations a medieval knight could face was not defeat in battle, nor even aging of the body, but the understanding that the world did not wait. Time moved forward steadily, indifferent to loyalty, sacrifice, or years of service. While knights carried their past with them, the world around them continued to change. Warfare itself began to shift. New weapons appeared. Tactics evolved. Armies relied less on individual mounted warriors and more on organized formations, infantry, and ranged weapons. The battlefield that once centered on knights slowly transformed into something unfamiliar. Strength and armor mattered less than coordination and numbers. Knights who had trained their entire lives for one kind of war found themselves increasingly out of place. Skills that had once defined them were no longer as valuable. The authority they once carried weakened. Younger soldiers learned different methods, fought differently, and answered to different expectations. Political landscapes shifted as well. Lords fell from favor. Alliances dissolved. New powers rose. A knight's loyalty, once a source of pride, could suddenly feel misplaced. Years of service tied to a banner that no longer mattered left knights feeling stranded between eras. Imagine a knight standing on the edge of a training ground, watching younger men practice with unfamiliar weapons, unfamiliar formations. He recognizes none of the techniques they use. Their world is not his. And yet, it continues without pause. Castles changed purpose. Some became administrative centers rather than military strongholds. Others fell into disrepair. Roads improved slowly. Trade expanded. The rhythm of life adjusted, leaving behind the traditions that once felt permanent. This transition was not dramatic. It was gradual, subtle, and deeply unsettling. There was no moment when a knight was told he was no longer needed. There was only a growing sense of irrelevance. Fewer summons. Fewer opportunities. Fewer reasons to wear armor at all. For men whose identity had been built entirely around service and readiness, this shift felt like erasure. The world they had shaped with their bodies and lives no longer reflected them back. Some knights adapted. They found new roles as administrators, landholders, or advisors. Others struggled, unable to let go of a version of themselves that no longer fit. They clung to habits, stories, and symbols that meant little to a changing world. This disconnection created a quiet grief. Not loud enough to be noticed, but persistent enough to shape daily life. Knights felt themselves becoming relics, reminders of a time that was slipping away. And yet, the myths only grew stronger. While living knights faded quietly, the idealized version of knighthood solidified. The past was preserved in story even as the present moved on. The world honored the idea of the knight more than the men who still lived. This contradiction was perhaps the final burden of knighthood. To give everything to a role, only to watch it become obsolete while its legend flourished without you. As the years passed, many knights learned to let go. Some resisted. Some found peace. Others simply endured, as they always had. And at last, when nothing more was asked of them, when the armor lay untouched and the world no longer called, there was only one thing left to do: to rest. Chapter 18. Letting the Armor Rest. There comes a moment, often unnoticed, when a knight no longer reaches for his armor. It does not happen suddenly, and it is not announced. The armor simply remains where it was last set down, untouched as days pass, then weeks, then seasons. Dust gathers quietly. Leather stiffens. Metal dulls. And with that stillness, something within the knight begins to settle as well. For most of his life, armor had been an extension of the body. It shaped movement, posture, and even thought. To wear it was to be prepared, alert, and defined. Without it, there is an unfamiliar lightness, followed quickly by uncertainty. Who is a knight when there is no longer a need to fight? In the quiet of later years, memories surface more often. Not in order, and not always gently. Faces appear without warning. The sound of metal returns in dreams. Long marches, cold mornings, and moments of fear drift through the mind. These memories do not demand explanation anymore. They simply exist, like echoes of a life lived under constant pressure. There is also relief. The body, worn and tired, no longer has to prove itself. Pain remains, but it no longer carries expectation. The need to be ready fades. The constant vigilance softens. For the first time, rest becomes possible, not the shallow rest of a guarded sleep, but a deeper stillness. The world beyond the night continues, as it always has. Seasons change. Villages grow and fade. New stories replace old ones. The knight watches this quietly, no longer needing to stand at the center of it all. His role is finished, even if the world never formally acknowledges it. What remains is not glory, but endurance. A life measured not by victories, but by persistence. By the ability to keep going through hardship, fear, loss, and change. This endurance, though rarely celebrated, is the truest legacy of knighthood. The myths will continue. Armor will shine in stories. Battles will be remembered as moments of certainty and courage. But beneath those myths lived real people. Men who endured far more than the stories allow, and who asked for very little in return. To understand that is not to diminish knighthood. It is to honor it honestly. As the armor rests, so too can the mind. The long journey through duty, pain, and purpose finally slows. There is nothing left to prove. No orders to follow. No expectations waiting. Only quiet. Thank you for staying with me through this long story. Whether you listen closely or let it play softly in the background, your time here truly matters. If you found this journey calming or meaningful, you're always welcome to support the channel by liking the video and considering subscribing. It helps these long, quiet stories continue. And if you feel like sharing, I would genuinely love to know where you're listening from. It's a small reminder that these stories travel far beyond where they're told. For now, allow the medieval world to fade gently. Let the weight of armor lift. Let the road grow quiet. Whether you're drifting into sleep or simply resting your thoughts, may calm follow you into the night. Thank you for being here. Rest well.